I still don't have a video feed, and I have two people live. Whoever is here listening, I tell you what, guys, my live stream this week has no video element because my webcam's still screwed up, apparently. But I do have a new stuff as soon as Amazon drops it off, and I hope that people don't mind the just audio element for the time being. I would have included it in the description, but I guess I didn't. I wanted to spend some time today talking about what makes a prison a good place to do time or a bad place to do time. I remember whenever I read the book that the movie Catch Me If You Can is based upon. I believe it was still called Catch Me If You Can. It was written by Frank Abagnale, who was a con man and a Czech flighter who did time in a number of countries, which is something that is left out of the movie starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks. As such, Frank Abagnale was qualified to speak about prisons in different countries. And because he'd done time in a couple of places, he had more authority than most. He said the worst place that he did time, and bearing in mind this is 40 years ago now, but was France. The way he described it was that in France, his year sentence was essentially just living in a tiny little cell that dripped in the back of the wall, having your food and your water slid through a hole in the door, and then they took the bucket that they put the food and water in out later, and that was your entire human contact in a day. He described doing prison in some more, I guess, humane or modern prisons too, and it was interesting to read his account of what made a bad prison, because it got me thinking about the worst places that I did time. He did not have a cellmate. Whenever Frank Abagnale was doing time in France, the way he described it was that because he didn't speak French, he really didn't even understand that the place he was doing time he was going to be at for the entirety of a year. He'd been waiting to get processed to a prison where he'd be doing easier time, and he just kept waiting. In California, of course, things aren't this bad. Look, I did 16 years, and probably the greatest hardship that I endured was being really cold in a cell. And I don't mean losing a finger cold, I mean I was shivering. Or occasionally not having quite enough to eat, so my stomach rumbled. Prison is a bad place to be, but by and large, it's bad because of the people, the guards and the prisoners. The actual living conditions are downright humane. The worst time that I did within the bounds of the rules, where the time was bad, even though the rules weren't being broken, was definitely whenever I was housed in the dayroom bunks at SADF. You see, CDC was suffering from an overcrowding problem, the California Department of Corrections. They had almost twice as many inmates in the system as they had beds that were designed to house these inmates. Mind you, the system was designed for some overflow. They were designed to be able to hold, I believe it was 137% capacity. Meaning whenever they say we're at 100% capacity, they don't really mean it. They have some extra beds. They were at 200% capacity. The way they achieved this number was just by building more beds without building more cells. They had gymnasiums where they had things like basketball courts and exercise equipment. All right, well, build a bunch of bunks, slap in some toilets and some sinks, and call it a living area. Fit 120 dudes in a place not too much bigger than a couple of basketball courts, no problem. Similarly, the dayroom bunks were just the areas in a building that had been set aside as common area for the 100 inmates who lived in cells. They took that common area and slapped up 40 bunks and said, okay, so instead of a common area, we're going to call this the dayroom bunks. And then they took one cell and removed everything out of it. They got the inmates out, they got the bunks out, and they put in an extra toilet. And now that's where the inmates who live in the dayroom bunks will use the restroom. because these areas weren't designed to house inmates, it was just overflow housing essentially. There were a lot of basic sanitation procedures, housing procedures that CDC didn't bother to install because they only planned to have these things occupied for a couple of years. They ended up being occupied for about a decade until the court made them take them out. But some of the basic sanitation stuff, the basic electrical stuff that they just never bothered to install, resulted in things being pretty terrible in the dayroom bunks, or at least pretty ridiculous. Everybody had little televisions or fans or whatever, but there were no electrical outlets. So you had jury-rigged extension cords that were not technically allowed, that people were burying at various points along the seams of the concrete, and then putting blankets over and hoping they wouldn't get taken away so they could run power to the bunks. Similarly, you had a big cooler of water off to the side so that people could drink water. And they all had to walk off to the side and then into what was just, a cell that they took the door off of and tossed an extra toilet in. And the worst part for me, and of course, I'm sure other people are going to have various opinions as to what the worst thing about the dayroom bunks was, it was sleeping. I have sleep apnea. It's a common condition. It just means I don't sleep as well as the next guy does. But whenever you coupled that with the sleeping conditions in the dayroom bunks, because first, it's still a common area. There's still your 19 bunk mates that live there that are always milling around, talking, perhaps even bumping into your bed. It happens. There are also the 200 inmates who lived in the building whose common area they took to put the bunks up in the day room. Well, they all need someplace to go too. So your living area ends up being at least a little bit of their common area. They walk past your area. Maybe if they're playing guitar, they'll be just a little bit closer than they would be to somebody else because you don't have a living area. And this impacts your sleep, all this traffic, all this movement in the day if you're the kind of guy who takes a nap. At night, well, that's whenever you do get to sleep and it quiets down. It wouldn't have been okay if there had been one guy who wanted to play music real loud or sing to himself or some ridiculous thing like that in these dayroom bunks. Well, somebody might have killed him because everybody valued their sleep in these conditions. The thing was, they never turned the lights off. It would be a security risk. This isn't just your living area. This is also the common area outside of the cell for the 200 inmates that lived there before they put these cells up. As such, the cops need to walk around it, look in the cells, make sure the inmates are still there, and then check you also. That's part of their job. Since they need the lights on all the time, since they need to walk all the time, well, your quality of sleep is going to be impacted just that extra little bit more. And if you watched for it, you could see guys show up in the dayroom bunks and realize this was where they were going to be sleeping and try and settle into it, try and adjust. You keep an eye on them for a day or two or three, and they just get more and more tired, haggard. They get the wan look in their face, and then eventually something would click. They'd decide that they could sleep. The hypervigilance would tone down a little bit, or maybe they found a good set of earplugs, or they just got so tired they could finally rest. And then the next day, they'd be walking around just laughing and happy because they had that reset. They had that good night's sleep. And it's not a guarantee. It's not an every night thing whenever you live in this kind of living environment. Of course, small amounts of sleep, electricity that is intermittent. Maybe you can't always have your TV plugged in. No running water. You have to walk a couple hundred feet. These are incredibly small complaints. I try and bear in mind, and I've been saying it a lot recently, that there is a literal army of people who are locked up internationally that would give their right arm for a chance to do time someplace where the complaints are that, well, you have to walk a little bit of a ways to get the nice clean running water, and there isn't always electricity, just some of the time. I've mentioned before that I had a friend who was a Russian Jew, and we were not close, and I don't know that we could have been because he didn't always communicate very well. I'm not even sure he liked me that much, but he had the funniest response to whenever anybody complained. Well, they turned off the hot water, so I'm going to have to take a cold shower. I hate taking cold showers. This stinks. Or they were going to give us dinner, but they gave us something that was bad instead. And I thought I was going to get a hamburger, and instead they gave us this cat food meal. I'm unhappy. Sergei would laugh. He'd say, do you know in Russia, I was a rich man. I was in the gangs. I did things. People listened to me. I didn't always have electricity. I didn't always have a hot food. Sometimes it just went out and you dealt with it. You put up with it. I am in prison, and I have hot running water every day. I have 3 hot meals anytime I want them. You don't know what bad is. Of course, this was in his thick Russian accent that I couldn't possibly replicate. But it is an important thing to bear in mind. Hi, Glenda. Yeah, anybody who is just tuning in, I have continuing video problems. I thought that they were fixed. I have an Amazon package, which theoretically was delivered on October 5th. Next week, the live stream, I expect to be back the way it was. But for now, I'm just tossing up audio. And if anybody is not enjoying just the audio, I will probably recycle some of this content in later videos. You're not going to miss anything important. I'm just going to go ahead and keep telling stories about doing time. And for anybody who is enjoying it, well, thank you for listening. And I do mean that sincerely. It is the thing about doing time. Criminal justice. The criminal justice system, that's what it's called. And I never liked that term. I always preferred the legal system because it really is just laws. And that's part of the irony that people who go into law enforcement have to come to terms with is you enter law enforcement, whether it's a cop, whether it's a lawyer or a judge, whether it's a correctional officer, in your mind, you're helping people. You're making the world safer. It's one of the reasons you get into that kind of career, hopefully. Unfortunately, you don't always have discretion about the manner in which you enforce the laws because it's a legal system, not a justice system. The story Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. It tells a great story about Jean Valjean, who tried to feed his family. He couldn't figure it out, and so he stole a loaf of bread and then went to prison. And the rest of the story is about his incarceration, his rehabilitation. The crime is meant to be an afterthought. It's just why he went to prison. But he does note, Jean Valjean, that is, does note, he didn't have to steal that bread. Yes, he stole it for his family, but perhaps there were other ways. It wasn't the last recourse. He did it because he was desperate, not because he was starving. It's that desperation. People who work in law enforcement, in whatever flavor, they run into that desperation a lot. And maybe it's not Jean Valjean. Maybe it's not a guy who stole a loaf of bread. Maybe it's somebody who wanted some drugs and got desperate, decided to do something stupid and dangerous to get those drugs. And yeah, he's going to go to prison for it, and maybe he'll get better. Maybe it's a good thing he goes to prison. But in that moment, whenever he's caught and he's begging, please, man, just let me go. I got a wife and kids, or whatever his story is, and it may all be true. Well, that's not a fun moment for the cop. That doesn't feel like justice, or maybe it does, depending on the case. But what it is, it's law enforcement. He has a job. He doesn't have discretion. He can't say, you seem like a good dude, and I get it. I actually had a friend who liked meth. So, yeah, you go ahead. You take that money you stole, and don't steal any more, man. I'm going to trust you. Maybe there is some cop that did that, but that is not his job. Same as a district attorney. It's not his job to say, well, I kind of like the guy, so I'm not going to hit him too hard. It's his job to prosecute the law, enforce the law. I had one friend. His name was Joey. he was the closest I got to meeting somebody who was Jean Valjean, as it were. Now, mind you, Joey was not without stain. This was not a saint in prison. Whenever he'd been younger, I think he's 19 or 20, he'd done some stupid stuff. And I mean stupid stuff. I think it was a GTA and a looting, or nobody was hurt, but somebody could have been. And because it was just a stupid mistake, it wasn't the type of thing that ruins lives, the judge and the district attorney didn't ruin Joey's life. They gave him a pretty good deal because he was looking at serious time, as I recall, for the crime, or at least reasonably serious. He's looking at doing 5 or 6 years. They gave him a suspended sentence. Occasionally, whenever they decide it's in the interest of justice to not punish somebody too much, they'll say, you're guilty. We found you guilty, and we have the option of sending you to prison for X amount of time, 5 years in this case. But we are not going to do that. We are going to suspend that sentence. You owe 5 years in prison. And if you can go 5 years without messing up, we'll call it even. But if you get in trouble between now and then, well, you're going to go to prison and you're going to finish out that amount of time. This is a dangerous game to play, and a lot of people have went to prison and done real time on a suspended sentence where they agreed, well, I'm not going to get in any more trouble and I'm going to be really careful. So what if I have a 5-year sword of Damocles hanging over my head? That's what Joey did. He took a 5-year suspended sentence and he behaved himself for, it was a year and a half, 2 years, and money got tight. He was an operator. He worked on a construction site. I don't recall the piece of equipment that he used, but it wasn't incredibly complex. It was a Caterpillar or something like that. He lost his job on the construction site, got into an argument with his boss. He didn't do anything crazy and hurt somebody or throw a bottle of booze and get drunk, but he lost his job, and it became real to him that he was going to lose his house, that his wife and kids weren't going to have a place to stay because he lost his job. Again, stupid mistake. Apparently, this is the type of thing he did, and it's unfortunate. The decision that he reached was that he was going to go back to his job site that Friday and steal the piece of equipment that he usually operated. He still had the keys. He went in Friday evening after the job site shut down, and he found someplace else and contracted out as a private contractor and did 2 days of work over the weekend to make his house payment with the stolen equipment. The reason he got caught was that he planned on returning this stuff Sunday night, and whenever he did, they found it missing already, and the police were quickly called and arrested him on site. This might have been a pretty minor crime. This is grand theft, but he was caught returning it and literally went out and did work with it to make a house payment. Except that he already had a 5-year suspended sentence hanging over his head. And so I met this guy there at Sad F in the dayroom bunks. This was my first experience being SNY. And it was one of the first guys that I met where I was on like an actual yard with a bunch of child molesters and rapists and whatnot. I was just adjusting to being in these bunks. I was still all wan and bleary-eyed, trying to get used to the idea that you didn't get full 8 hours of sleep at a time. And I sat down at breakfast across from Joey. Hey, how you doing, man? I'm Aaron. I'd only been there 2 days at this point. He said one sentence to me, and I heard him say this sentence about 20 times. Hey, look, I don't mean to be rude, but I got to see some paperwork if I'm going to talk to you. It's just that. And he meant it. For whatever reason, and I probably agree with his reasons, he decided that he had to be SNY, but that he wasn't going to talk, literally just going to shut him down, wanted nothing to do with guys that were in on crimes of a sexual nature, crimes that were in on a sexual nature, rapists, pedophiles, that type of thing. We got along great, needless to say. I broke out my paperwork, he broke out his, and he did eventually get to parole. I only did time with him for about 9 months. But it was interesting to do time with somebody who, not only was he not a criminal, I met guys who claimed to be innocent and who obviously weren't gang members, and Joey wasn't a gang member or anything like that. He stole a Caterpillar to go do some construction work. But in addition to that, he seemed like a genuinely kind guy who just had some impulse control problems, maybe, and did stupid stuff. I'm sure if you went and talked to his boss, the guy he got into an argument with and then later on broke into the site and stole some equipment, his boss has some really negative things to say about him. I'm slowly going through some of my old letters and paperwork, and I know I have Joey's address that he paroled to somewhere in my stuff because he sent me a book of stamps and a letter a couple of weeks after he got out, just saying, hey, I got out, and I hope you get out too, essentially, and look me up whenever you do. As I recall, he said that I had an open invitation to a barbecue at his place. I could just show up and he'd toss some burgers and a steak on the grill. That was 15 years ago, though. So I'm thinking if I do find his address, I will call ahead. I won't just show up at the door. Hey, Joey, you remember that felon from 15 years ago? Hey, pretty fly for a Wi-Fi. My video is still a little wonky, but I'm hopeful to have it fixed next week for the live stream. And for now, I've had at least a couple of guys say that they don't mind just the audio, so I'm going to toss it out there, and anybody that wants to listen to it absolutely can. And I may recycle some of the content from my regular videos that I try and be a little bit more professional with. I hadn't thought about Joey for years. I remember whenever he was paroling, he had a problem with a lifer. And this is going to be an example where I pulled I guess maybe it's a snitch move. This is the kind of thing where if I were an active inmate and I said something like this, well, they would have just called me a rat and had a problem. A gentleman with whom I was acquainted, Jay, had a problem with Joey. I don't know why. Just whatever. They had a problem with each other. Jay was a lifer, doing 25 to life on a pretty brutal murder. And Jay was working to get out, trying hard. And I can respect that. Some lifers really work to get out, and you have to, because or at least you had to at the time, because the board was quick to deny people. If you got in a fight with somebody, 5 years later, whenever you went in and said, I'd like to parole, please, they'd say, well, yeah, but you got in a fight 5 years ago. How are we supposed to trust that you're not violent? Jay told Joey, and I'm going to try and remember the exact words, hey, in 3 days in the morning, before you parole, me and Frank over here are going to touch you up a little bit just so you can parole with a bruise or two, so you're not going to tell anybody out there that you were running things. I don't think they were actually going to. I think it was just an idle threat because they knew that Joey wasn't really a criminal, didn't want none. He just wanted to go home. Joey looked stressed. He was obviously thinking that they were serious about it, and I took the opportunity to intercede. I said, well, Jay, you can do that, but I promise I'm going to write Joey every 6 months for the rest of the time I have, reminding him he's allowed to write the parole board and talk about the way that you acted, that he's allowed to give a victim impact statement if you hurt him. And the parole board for the next 15 years will be using whatever the heck he has to say about the way you act for the next couple of days as whether or not they keep you in prison or not, man. And if we're being honest, it's not fair, that type of threat. I used it because I felt for Joey. I felt him being stressed out that the day he paroled, the day that he was waiting for to go back to his family, he was going to do it missing a couple of teeth and with a big shiner or something like that. And of course, Jay backed down because this was a serious threat, a real threat. The threat is literally, you'll die in prison if you do that. Because the system's unbalanced. It's unfair. It's not necessarily a legal system or a criminal justice system. It's just the system we have. And whenever you know that there's a flaw in the system like that, well, using it as a threat, I suppose, is about the equivalent to, we're going to touch you up, we're going to beat you up, because the power balance is so unequal. Thankfully, Jay backed down, as he reasonably should have. I don't know if Jay ever paroled. I suppose I'll look him up too one of these days. So many unanswered questions about the time I did. I know that it's nice to have nice, neat knots at the end of a story, but that is one of the things about doing time, is a lot of it is just unanswered question, unraveled threads. my good friend Wolf, who was cellies with me, and he was a killer. I recall on one occasion they took him out to medical, and the cop told me, "Hey, pack his stuff." I ended up seeing Wolf again, but at that time I thought that was the conclusion of my relationship with Wolf, that he went out to medical, he might have died, he might not have. All the cop had to say was, "Pack his stuff, we'll get you a new cellie in a couple of days." That is how most stories in prison end. I don't have any information on Jaime Osuna, how he got the jump on a seasoned inmate. I don't have the frame of reference there. Green Chili asked if I would weigh in on a fight, I guess. I hadn't heard about it. But if you wanted to give me a frame of reference in the comments, or heck, email me at californiaconvictions@gmail.com. I'll find out what I can and talk about it. As it turns out, I have insight into some aspects of doing time, correctional environments, things like that. I'm legitimately happy to answer any question anybody has. Go ahead, toss it in the side there, toss it in the comments, ask next time there's a live stream. I have no idea what doing that ridiculous amount of time was good for. It really just feels like 16 years that I can check off the calendars and forget about some days. But if I can answer questions, if I can carry something out of there, heck yeah, go ahead and ask. I'll do what I can. Well, we're about 26 and a half minutes in, and I plan on this one being about a half hour. So I'm going to move on to the general wrap-up, where I insert some hackneyed shtick occasionally about we should be better people. We should not take things for granted. And it's hard to say what essentially amounts to the same thing again and again. But that's the fact of the matter, is that things that are true, deeply true, like we only have this life, we shouldn't take it for granted. The people that we love, we should tell them that we love them. Things that are deeply true, they're also simple. They aren't complex. You can't spend 2 hours elaborating on how your wife and children, or your husband and children, or your parents are the thing that make your life worthwhile. You can, and perhaps you'll be happy to do so, but it will not carry the gravity that you feel. Bolozov said essentially that. He was the leader of the Human Kindness Foundation, who did outreach for inmates. He said, the real truths, they're deep and simple. Thank you very much for listening today. And I'll hopefully next week be back with just a slightly higher quality video and about the same thing to say otherwise. Have a nice day.